You know, you may question the effectiveness of the hearings or what they really answer given the partisan questioning on both sides, but what's happening in Flint does bring the issue of water safety and lead levels to communities across the country. So let's start there tonight with our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Hey guys, it's good to see you. And again, you know, we just keep hearing more of the testimony this week in Washington. And as we record our show right now, the governor is testifying as we speak. So we have to put out the disclaimer a little bit. But no, let me start with you. The significance of Governor Snyder sitting down in Washington right now, testifying in front of that congressional.
Yeah, I think it's a risky thing. I'm not sure he should have done it. I think he probably had to do it, you know, as he tries to climb out of this hole he's in terms of public trust. I think transparency is important. I think anxious to see how he's received by the panel. I know it's going to be a little shorter session. They're not going to keep him there, you know, hour on end. But this is risky. But he wanted to, you know, he wrote a piece for us this afternoon. That, you know, he wanted to be, you know, to show that he's serious about getting this right.
And he wants to take his digs also at the federal government, at the EPA in particular, knowing full well that the state had a lot of blame in this. But I think by going to Washington, he wants to say, well, it wasn't just us.
Yeah, well, and his story has been, it's not just me. I mean, that's been the sort of frustrating part of this, is that whether it's the EPA or the MDEQ, which he does supervise, or Health and Human Services, he's sort of said, well, all these other people were supposed to do their jobs and they didn't. So, you know, my culpability is somehow diminished by that. And I think that's a very tough sell, given that he is the chief executive, but also given that this is a guy who ran both times for election and as someone who would manage state government better than we had seen before. And so he's got a serious credibility gap right now in terms of you know, promise versus
performance. Does this do anything about helping that credibility gap, Nolan?
Well, yeah, I think it's good that he didn't have to go, and it's highly unusual for a sitting governor to be called before Congress or to go before Congress. I mean, there are separation issues, federalism issues, and I think he decided it's better to go than to look like he had something to hide. But if you look at the hearing on Tuesday and then again on today, the central theme running through here is that government failed at every level. A lot of finger pointing on Tuesday. I assume there'll be more finger pointing today as Gina McCarthy from the EPA and the governor testify. They're both sort of like this. Everybody is. But government failed at every level here. Federal, state, local. It is probably the most shocking example of bureaucratic breakdown at every level. Again, no agency sort of picked up and covered for the failure of the next. The state didn't sound the warning. The EPA didn't sound the warning. The local officials were inept and incompetent. There were no heroes here within the government.
So then bottom line is,
including in the governor's office, where
the governor's office. But then bottom line is, so we finish with all of these hearings. What do we get out of all of this?
Well, you know, congressional hearings don't have a point generally. It's to allow Congress people the ability to look really angry and like they're doing something on television, and they go on, and there's very little that they can do to the governor. I mean, that's an absolute separation of powers issue. One thing that's interesting this week also is the USA Today has a story out this week about the lead levels in water nationwide.
Right.
Allison Young, who used to be a Free Press reporter, now is a reporter there, has a really great story about putting this all in context. And what's important about that here is two things. One, you know, there is elevated lead levels in lots of communities, but it points up the tragedy here, that we were going in the right direction in Flint for a really long time. Lead levels in kids in Flint were lower than they were in most communities, and we had been making a lot of progress in that regard. And this switch from the Detroit water to the Flint River without treating it sent them back up. And so the failure there is again in this dramatic reversal that was totally avoidable, and the fault of bureaucracy that never got its act together to do it the right way.
If you look at Flint and the Flint Water Department, you had seniority bumping. You had a whole lot of people in the water department who used to work in other departments. They weren't experts in their field. I mean, it just really does shine that light on government failure, but it also, I think, and it highlights, and I think one of the reasons the governor wanted to go down to Washington and talk about this is the massive infrastructure need nationwide here. We didn't used to think about lead or anything else in our water, and now every time you turn on the tap, no matter whether you live in Flint or 1,000 miles away, you got to wonder what's coming out of that, because our infrastructure is so old and broken in this country, and we've neglected it. We've spent the money on other things, and now the bill's coming due, and we've got no clue how to pay for that.
And and I think that really is the bigger picture here when you look at these congressional hearings, that people now, and it's taken a while for the Flint story, I think, to get across the nation. And while Flint, there was a perfect storm of so many things that happened all at once there, and a man-made disaster, you could really argue. But I do think it now does raise the question about what is coming out of my tap when I'm living in Massachusetts, or if I'm living in a city in New Jersey who's had historic problems with lead issues, or talking about the training of the people on staff and all of these places around the country. Do we have the right people in places to do the proper testing? Do we actually know what's in our water? And I do think that series that the USA Today put out yesterday afternoon, I'd highly recommend it for people to take a look, that is happening in small towns sometimes that don't have enough personnel or don't have the expertise to do the testing, and it's even happening in larger places. So it does raise this bigger question, but then if we have this bigger conversation of, all right, well, let's take a look at our infrastructure and let's look at how many billions of dollars it would take.
13 trillion for water systems nationwide. That's the backlog.
And this same thing happened in Washington, D.C. a few years ago without this much attention, without this much fanfare. It's one of the things Mark Edwards, who was involved in that situation, the Virginia Tech professor who's been exposing this, said, the EPA did the same thing in Washington, D.C., a city that's run by the federal government.
Okay, so let's say that coming out of these hearings, maybe there's some larger kind of crackdown at the EPA. Maybe that there's better education for some of the workers there, or you're going to toss a couple of people from there. Does that still, though, is there any kind of political will to start this infrastructure conversation about pipes around the country or not? Or is this, do we sit here and then we say, well, that really is still just kind of Flint and move on?
No, because until there's a crisis, we don't see it. And, there's always something more showy, that you can get more political value out of spending the money on. I mean, the federal government spends an enormous amount of money on a whole lot of things and not nearly enough on infrastructure. And I think we've got to start prioritizing that.
Well, it's not just prioritizing. I mean, there's money that you're going to have to, you're not going to find that money just sitting around doing other things that you're going to stop.
We had $1 trillion spent in 2008 that was supposed to be, stimulus money. It was supposed to be going into these kind of infrastructures projects. Only about 20% went into the nation's infrastructure because they started the pork barreling. They started spreading the money.
It's inefficient. Government is not always efficient, but it is always effective. You did the projects the projects that got done with that money did what they were supposed to do. The other purpose of that money was to stop us losing 700,000 jobs a month,
and
which
infrastructure
we were
work
at the time,
creates more jobs than anything else, Steve.
Right.
And that's where this money should have gone, and it didn't.
Well, it did.
It went to everybody's some of it did, but not much. It went to everybody's little pet project in Washington. We had money going, just outrageous places. And so, again.
Let's be clear that this was not a water pipe replacement project.
Absolutely.
The stimulus was not. It was never.
But in other places, it is. I mean, you've still got lead lines going in every community, perhaps in the communities we live.
Well, I mean, for instance, in Baltimore, they have not been able to drink water, use the tap water in schools for a decade. I mean, that's been going on forever. When I lived in Baltimore, it wasn't just water. The lead paint issue in East Baltimore with old homes that have been demolished, and there's lead dust all over the place. I mean, this is a huge problem in a lot of cities. That doesn't mean that Flint is not the tragedy that we've been making it. It is, but again, the tragedy there is that we had solved that problem, or we were really close to it, and we set ourselves back several years.
And the tragedy is that while we're sitting here today, people are still using bottled water. They are still not able to use their water from the tap. All right.